Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, Open University.
Hello. So this is a module on translation in the contemporary time. Strictly speaking, it's not about translation in exactly this contemporary time. It's about what happened in translation and translation studies in the second half of the 20th century. So we have reached up to what structuralism did to translation. That was in the first half of the 20th century. Now, this will give you roughly an idea about further developments. Okay, now the second half of the 20th century saw a proliferation of translation activities in industry, in law, in business and administration, and of course in communication. So I think we have already noted the point. Literary translation occupies a very peripheral, we can't even call it peripheral, a minimal, a completely marginalized role in translation at this point of time. So one can even call this period the age of the marginalization of literary translation. In fact, Lawrence Venuti had calculated in 1998 that literary translation occupied only 4% of the whole volume of translation. So probably now, at this point of time, in 2023, it is even less. So this is a movement. There is a movement towards the occupation of the stage of translation by other discourses. That's what's happening. Now, what is happening in world politics, which spurred certain kinds of translation? One was the assertion of the right to expression in the mother tongue of people all over the world, especially from the former colonies, territories colonized by European colonial powers. The mobilization of linguistic minorities in almost all multilingual societies, plus what we call post-colonial politics which stood up for the rights of the colonized people. So there was a demand for texts available to be made available in almost all the languages of the world, even very minor languages. So this spurred a great translation activity all over the world. And another interesting development during this period is the development of computer-aided translation. So it started sometime in the late 50s or the early 60s, and in half a century's time it has made big strides, extensively used in communication, very commonly used in producing drafts of knowledge texts before they are actually processed further. Okay. Its utility is now well established. Its functionality is well established. It's now no longer derided by skeptics. You don't speak about machine translation in such disparaging terms. No. And it's both its possibilities and limitations have been realized. One is that it works only as far as the language is fed into the computer. So how much of a language can you feed into the computer? This language is such a big phenomenon with a history of nearly 1 lakh years. So you're trying to feed the whole system, its structure, its intricacies into the computer. So there is a certain limit beyond which you can't go. And that will be shown in the output that a computer produces. And you require human intervention at every stage. You need to pre-edit the material before it is fed into the computer, and then post-edit it, the output that a computer gives you. And there are lots of jokes about computer translation, especially the one about a Chinese computer which translated the flesh is weak but the spirit is strong, as the meat is rotten but the wine is good, taking those two terms in literal in their literal senses. So such jokes abound, howlers made by computers in translation. But that apart, we have a situation now where we recognize the worth of computer-aided translation. I think all of us use Google Translate now, right? And we know that some post which you can't read, which is in some language that you don't know, can be translated to make it at least minimally legible. So you find this legend underneath posts: translate this passage, translate this post, and you do it. And you give text to Google Translate for translation into your language, from a language which you don't know. This is happening all the time. So the advances that have been made in machine translation is there for everybody to see. Now, another big area is the audiovisual medium, cinema and television. What we now call audio-visual translation has happened in a big way. So everybody is familiar with subtitling, dubbing, and the less familiar audio description is now coming into its own. So dubbing, we know, we have seen it, how foreign films are dubbed into our languages, and we have also seen the attendant problems, such as the need to produce lip sync. So the conversation must come on when the lips of the character moves, not before or after. Syncing is very important. So the text has to be adjusted, and lots of translation shifts happen. You can't think of a word by word translation at all. Perhaps a sense by sense, sense for sense translation occurs, but very carefully done, right? And subtitling also. There are a number of constraints of the space, the frame, constraints of the action on the frame, Your subtitles shouldn't intrude into the action, the size of the subtitles, color. There are a number of factors which go into production of subtitles. But all these are being honed now. The skills are being honed, and we can think of good subtitles which make any audiovisual text comprehensible. And audio description is a new phenomenon, comparatively new phenomenon. This is primarily meant for visually challenged people. You describe a visual in detail. You describe a mise-en-scene, what you find. For example, when you're talking about the studio, I can describe its walls, the furniture here, the screens I can see here, the equipment that I can see. If any personnel is here, I can describe their dress. I can give a visually challenged person a complete idea about this scene, what I see here. So that is audio description. So audio description is now becoming popular. Many films have audio described versions available. It's becoming common in India also. First introduced in the West, now becoming common in India too. And this is another interesting area, sign language translation. So sign language is increasingly being used in education and communication. There are sign language classes, okay, where instructors use sign language for the hard of hearing and vocally challenged people. They can get their education in sign language. Occasionally, you have a person using normal spoken language acting as the instructor, but who is being translated by a sign language interpreter to people in the classroom. And of course, you have seen sign language news being signed, not read. You can't call it reading the news, signing the news. So there are certain TV channels which produce sign language news every day. Okay, the technology facilitates that. And of course, other forms of sign language translation aided by computers. You have a person standing, signing before the camera of a computer, and the computer converts it into text or speech, even speech. So if you sign something, if you sign for good morning, the system will say, the computer will say good morning. If you sign I came late today, the computer will say I came late today. So technology has stepped in a big way to facilitate sign language translation. Translation, the new media again. A new media. You can't think of life without the new media. You can't think of life without social media sites. Okay, without Facebook or WhatsApp. So instant translation is available on social media. As I said, you can translate. You can get a message, a post translated. Increasing numbers of people are relying on such translations. Technology has facilitated that. Although with all the attendant problems, we have not yet reached a stage where you can get a completely error-free translation of a message. But it is possible. It's possible. Okay, it might come about in the distant future, although not a completely perfect translation. Yet, a possible translation of your messages and posts will become available in the near future. Okay, now let's see what the post-colonial world was doing with translation. So, the attempt was to reverse the hierarchy of both writing and translation. Originally, the passage was from the colonial languages, the language of the colonizers, into the language of the colonized. And with the attendant issues of political domination. And here now the attempt was to reverse it. The attempt to translate, to write back to the center, as Salman Rushdie said. Okay. So literary translation was the preferred kind of translation. Okay. Transmitting, writing back to the center about your culture, and in the process assaulting the target language, to take liberties with it. Okay, something much like what Walter Benjamin suggested in his essay. So that was happening. That was happening all over the world in the early part of the second half of the 20th century, from newly liberated post-colonial societies. And in a more ordinary, mundane way, organizations of nations were finding translation a very useful activity. Nations which spoke different languages, but were united on some common ground, political ground, like the European Union, Organization of African States, South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation. All these as organizations of nations found translation a very useful activity. For one, they could make translations of the public documents available on notice immediately. They could go for real-time interpretation or translations in conferences and seminars organized by these organizations. And it happened everywhere. It happened in Europe, it happened in Asia, it happened in Africa in a big way. Okay. And technology aided this process. And translation services were becoming available all over the world. And a pool of professional translators were coming into their own everywhere. And translation services offered them good remuneration. Translation was not hack work anymore. So in the European Union, for example, the remuneration was nearly €0.50 for a word, or perhaps a character, I believe. Not even for a word, for a character, a letter. So when you translate the word translation, translatation, how many words? More than 10. So you get about €6 to €8 for translating the single word. Such was the remuneration offered. And all over the world, there were government organizations, apart from non-governmental organizations, devoted to translation, taking up translation projects in a big way, like our own National Translation Mission in Mysore. And I'll end this part of this module by referring to a big experiment in translation in history. What happened in the Soviet Union in the second half of the 20th century, after the Second World War. A virtual explosion of translation. Translations among dozens of Soviet languages, and even small ones spoken by just a few thousand people. But translation was done. And primary education was conducted in such small languages too. Then translations from all these languages, all these Soviet languages into world languages. Translations from world languages into all these Soviet languages. The creation of a translation, a pool of translators consisting of thousands of translators. The use of translation as soft power. Power that does not flow through the barrel of a gun. Power that flows from the pages of a book by making available Soviet works to people all over the world, by disseminating ideas. This was the kind of soft war that the Soviet Union engaged in. And simultaneously, as this was happening, this Soviet experiment did not last very long. It ended with the end of the Soviet Union. Of course, the Progress publishers transformed themselves into Raduga publishers in the 1990s. They still carried on translation activities, but not in the same scale as it was done from 1950 to 1990. Right. And during this time, all over the world, there were big networks of publishers who published translations. There was a big demand for translations of works which were distinguished, which were awarded by various bodies of literary appreciation, and of course also for controversial works. And there were accomplished professional translators who were at work. And there was a global marketing available for these translations. There were networks for marketing translations in the major world languages. So we come to the end of this first part of this module. We'll be back after a short break. Thank you.